I'm Ken Rockwell. Let's look at some tips and tricks that I use with my Nikon Z7 Mark II. This applies just as well to the Z6 Mark II as well as to the older Z7 and older Z6 for the most part. And if there's any features the other cameras don't have, well, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Now, this is going to show you how to operate the camera and various tricks and tips that I use to make it a little easier to work with. In terms of taking great photographs, that has nothing to do with your camera. You can take great photographs with an iPhone. What you do need to do is you do need to know how to take great photographs, and for that I would simply go to my website, kenrockwell.com, and click the link for how to, and I've got a ton of articles about how to take great pictures. First off, we need to get this beast charged. Well, one thing you used to do in the olden days is you would pull out the battery and charge it in an external charger, and you can do that. Nikon still includes with some of these models an external charger, but I don't bother because the battery will charge in the camera. The way you do that is pop open this little door and you look for the USB connector there. You pop in your USB-C cable, and then you can either use a cord that goes to USB-A and it'll charge at about 7 watts, or you can charge it much more quickly, and maybe at about 10 watts or so. I've measured this but forget exactly. I just use a little charger that came standard with my Apple iPad and happens to have a USB-C cable. This way it all travels with me together. And this is a very quick charge. I think it charges in about 2 hours or so. Again, the specifics are all in my written review. But that's how I charge the battery. I don't even use the included little external charger. The only reason to use the external charger is if you have two batteries and you come back at the end of the day and you want to get them both charged up while you're sleeping, then you'd pull one and pop it in the external charger. When you do charge it, there's a tiny little invisible LED that lights up. You see this little tiny thing here where it says CHG for charge? That little dot, that will light up. But it also will get covered up by this, or because you have to pull this flap open, get covered over by the flap, so good luck. The little LED lights in amber while it's charging and extinguishes when it is done. Not only can you charge from a USB-C adapter, you can charge from your computer, you can charge from a power bank, you can even charge if you've got a really large solar cell, that should charge as well. Anything that makes USB-C. Now, if you use USB-C PD, power delivery, it charges more quickly, as I showed. The little Apple adapter there is USB-C PD. But again, even if you just use a good old-fashioned USB-A cord, it will charge not as quickly, but it doesn't matter. If you're charging it overnight, which is when I do it, you're good to go the next morning, no matter what. Now, other power sources. Yes, you can run it from the battery that's included. It'll also run off of USB-C if you have enough power. The gotcha is it only charges when the power is turned off. If the power is turned on, it's running from the USB-C power. You can also change that in the settings. You can go to Menu, Setup, USB power delivery, leave that on. If you turn that off, what that means is when you plug it in your USB-C cord, it won't run the camera, that the camera will only be running off of the battery. I leave that on. But if for some reason you only want to run from the battery, even if the cord's plugged in, set that to off. For power conservation, you're in luck. You don't have to turn this off every time you want to stop taking pictures. The camera usually times out, even if you're carrying it around, your body's against the viewfinder or whatnot. I find it works great. I can just leave it turned on and it goes to sleep. When you want to wake it up, being mirrorless, it doesn't always turn on instantly. In fact, if I turn it on here, it takes a moment to wake up. What I always do is when I want to bring the camera to my eye to take a picture, I tap the shutter to wake it up, and by the time I get it to my eye, then it's all good. For memory cards, this is 2 card slots. It has the larger slot, which takes CF Express Type B, Bravo, or it also takes XQD cards in the same slot, so it'll take both. And it also takes good old-fashioned SD cards, which are my preference, but, you know, to each their own. To open the card door, simple. Just slide your thumb like that. There's no latch. There's no nothing. It just works. It never opens by accident, and it always stays closed, and it's always easy to open when you want to open it. So I love the card door. The viewfinder has an automatic brightness control. It may vary as you point the camera up or down. So if you're playing back images and you're sort of pointing the camera down to something dark, the images may look dark on playback. So oftentimes on playback, especially if I'm outside, I'll point the camera at something light, like the sky, then press the playback button, which brightens up the viewfinder. The monitor control. Ordinarily, the way it comes from the factory is there is a sensor here that detects your face. So when your face is in front of it, you get the viewfinder. You take it away from your face, you get the LCD. If that gets mucked up, this button here is the monitor control button. And as you press this, you can get various options for viewfinder only, the back monitor only. You can prioritize the viewfinder, or automatic display switch is the way that I would leave it. There's lots of programmable buttons. Most of these buttons Especially the FN1 and FN2 buttons are easy to program. They are programmed at Menu, Custom Setting Menu, Controls, Custom Controls, and have at it. You can go to all the different controls here and program what they do. You'll also notice there's an adjustment to set what the lens function button does. In other words, if you have a lens with a button on it, that's where you can set what it does. Personally, I set my FN1 oftentimes the depth of field preview or magnify, and I set FN2 to control the autofocus functions, but that is your choice. You also can program what the lens control ring does. In other words, many of these lenses have an extra control ring like this one here. You control that at the same menu. You'll notice there's an additional option now for that. That's you control what the lens ring does. Focus, aperture, you name it, you got it. What kind of lenses? Well, ideally, use a Nikon Z lens, and they're marked Nikon Z. That's pretty obvious. Nikon have an adapter called an FTZ for F mount to Z mount. It doesn't work with half of the lenses that they have sold. It only works properly if you have an AFS lens, which will be AF-S, meaning autofocus silent wave motor. These lenses work just great on the FTZ. They autofocus fast, they're sharp, they're actually quite good. This is well recommended. I have problems with the fact that Nikon implies that all of their lenses made over the past 60 years will work properly. They don't work properly. They'll take a picture, but they don't work properly. If you have a traditional autofocus lens, like this lens that came out in 1993, the autofocus lenses from the 1980s and 1990s, most of them autofocus with a screw. So as this ring turns, the screw turns, and the way it focused was that there was a motor in the camera that turned that screw, that turned the ring, that made the lens focus. That would work great. The only problem is Nikon got cheap. There is no motor in this adapter. You'll notice there is no screwdriver bit here to focus your lens. So if you use this lens on this adapter, or any of these lenses from the 80s and 90s, and Nikon still manufactures and sells these lenses today, they will not autofocus on any of the Z cameras. They'll focus manually, and you'll have full data control and exposure control, and that's all good, but you're back to manual focus. So the question is, did you really want to buy a Nikon camera if these older lenses won't work, if you own those older lenses? And the answer is, I don't think you do. I have a whole video and page and explicit details about how to use older lenses, manual focus lenses, rangefinder camera lenses. I'd refer you to that, but just know that any of these things is more of an experiment when you start trying to adapt these other kinds of lenses. Unless you have an AFS lens, and Nikon still makes lots of these today. AFS lenses, they've been making these since the 1990s. These work just great. Also, AFP lenses from the DSLR should work just great on the FTZ. But avoid a traditional AF lens or manual focus lens. The manual focus lenses work even worse because there's no coupling of any data whatsoever. And if you really want to go crazy, strange but true, I have this adapter here and I have a separate review on this. The Fringer EF to NZ lets me use my Canon lenses on my Nikon Z cameras. Any of the Canon lenses made since 1987 will focus just great on my Z cameras. Why can't Nikon's cameras do that? Well, that's why I ask why shoot Nikon. But anyway, here we go. See? It loves it. Autofocus is just great on the Nikon Z cameras. Adapting lenses is usually a dopey idea. It sounds good to begin with, but it never worked as well as you're hoping it would because there's a lot more finesse involved in getting lenses to work well with a given camera. So stick with the Z lenses. If you already own the AFS lenses, stick with those, or feel free to buy them. I use mine, and you're good to go. Just don't think you're going to use your older traditional AF lenses on your Nikon Z. A weird thing about the Nikon autofocus system is when you're using the AFS or single focus and lock mode, the AF boxes turn green when they're locked, and that's good. And red means it's not locked and stop. That makes sense. The problem is in the AFC mode, the continuous AF mode, the red boxes means it's in focus and you're ready to go. That makes little sense, but that's the way it works. So just be forewarned that when you shoot this camera, that green or red don't necessarily mean what you think it does. It takes a little experience to know, but honestly, I don't like that. Oddly, there's also a low light AF option. Why that should be an option, I don't know, but it's under the custom shooting menu in autofocus. It's A10, at least on the Z7 Mark II. Low light AF, I leave that on. Autofocus tracking. Gosh, it doesn't always track just by magic the way you want it to track. The way to get it to track is you have to select AFC for continuous autofocus mode, and then you have to select the all area AF, which is this large box. And the way I'm selecting this is I programmed my FN2 button, which we covered 5 minutes ago. So I hold in the FN2 button and I turn on the front and the back dials to change those settings. Once you've set that, it does a pretty good job of locking on to whatever it finds and then tracking that around the finder. If you want to be more specific, for instance, if the camera's not magically locking on to whatever you want it to lock on to, pardon the prepositions, then you can press the center OK button, and now that that little beast there is going to lock on and stay attached to whatever it is. Now, you could move this around, but you won't want to do this unless you're locked down in a tripod, because it's a heck of a lot easier just to move the camera to assign an object onto which to lock focus. You see in there, it's doing its best here in this little pattern. This thing will pop up sometimes for no reason at all. To make it go away, you hit the minus button, and you're back to normal. Some folks like to have a rear button autofocus the lens so it only focuses when you push the rear button. The way to program that is quite simply go to Menu, Custom Settings, A for autofocus, A6, AF activation, program it so that it only goes on when you press the AF on button. And you can also enable or disable it, so you can make that a lock or make that so that it only focuses when you press that. Manual focus aids, it's got a lot. You can either just look through the finder and turn the ring until it's sharp. If you select the focus area manually, it'll turn from red to green when it's in focus, but it only does with one zone at a time. But you can put that zone anywhere in the picture. I program one of these function buttons so I can just magnify here. You can magnify to your heart's content. You can move the area that is magnified around, and that's what I'll do if I'm on a tripod. There's also a three-way null indicator. You see off in the corner here, there's a little dot. Those little dots are telling me in what direction to turn the ring so that I get perfect focus. You also see you get a little indication of the relative distance this focus from infinity down to close, but it won't read the actual distance. It's just a rough idea. You can also get focus peaking. If that's your preference, you get that at the custom settings D11, focus peaking, and you have your choice of the usual options of colors and strengths and so forth. When shooting, this is personal preference. I set everything to automatic, except for this auto button. I don't use this because when I set that to green there, it locks out a lot of the settings I do like to use. But essentially, I'll shoot in program, auto exposure, auto ISO, auto white balance, and auto everything, unless I have a good reason to take it off of auto, in which case I'll set it manually. Why do I do that? Simple. Decades of experience have shown me that it's faster at doing the basic rote mechanical settings than I am, and this way I can spend my time looking at my subject. I don't need to change anything. I'll just change it from there, but I'll let the camera get there first. But again, that is all personal. I never even set manual ISOs. That's important. I use auto ISO and set it to do what I want it to do. I set it to lowest shutter speed, usually to vary with the focal length of the lens, and I let it take it from there. In other words, it magically does. If you have the confidence to pay attention to what's going on, the auto ISO settings do exactly what you or I would do manually, but instead of having to change the ISO every time you look up, look down, and change it all around, it just does it in real time. Here's another pro trick. A lot of people just shoot at ISO 100 and they don't know why, just for the basic ISO. Well, this camera, the base ISO is 64. So I set everything to start at ISO 64, which just gives me a little bit more sharpness and a little bit cleaner images. It doesn't make that much of a difference, but if you can use 64, use 64 rather than 100. For silent shooting, there's an electronic shutter. You get to that at the menu, the photo shooting menu, and then you go, it's actually the bottom of the menu. I cheated here. I went one up, and what got me to the very bottom of the menu. Silent photography, that is the electronic shutter. You can't use flash or flicker reduction or HDR while in the silent mode, and the maximum ISO is 25,600. There's no limit on the minimum, but if you want to get to ISO 51,200 or any of the higher ones, you have to go to the regular shutter. Silent mode does work at all the shutter speeds from an 8,000th down to minutes. There's no bracket button on here. The way you get the bracketing is you go to the photo shooting menu, and then it's the option called auto bracketing. And then you have your usual options of all the usual things. If you want an electronic first curtain shutter, which I think is cool, because that way, instead of having a mechanical shutter open at the beginning, you have an electronic shutter, so you don't have to worry about things like self-timers necessarily. So you have a little bit more freedom from vibration. That is available at custom setting, D5, shutter type. See, that you can electronic first curtain, mechanical, or auto. For light metering, always shoot it in matrix. Matrix is the smartest metering mode. They include other modes for old-timers who knew things like sensor weighted and so forth, but those have all been obsolete. So if it ever gets off of matrix, set it back to matrix because that's the smartest mode. All this other crazy stuff I never use. I always shoot matrix, and if it's too dark or too light, I simply press the compensation button and add or remove usually no more than 2/3 of a stop, and I'm good to go. Matrix is the smartest mode. I would use that all the time. But again, that's art. You can use what you want. Image crop modes. I love to crop my images in camera as I shoot because I find this long 3:2 ratio is usually just too long. But again, this is art. It's your preference. I program this red button to be my crops, where I can get a DX crop, which is the same as a digital zoom. I can get square crops to match my Hasselblad, or ideal format 5:4 crops, which usually is a little bit better for most subjects, depending on what you're doing, especially if you're shooting verticals. But again, it's all art. It's what you want to do. For flash, Honestly, Nikon hasn't made a great flash with these little cameras in years. This is the flash that I use. It's a little SB400. The reason I use it is it's plenty bright, it's super smart, it locks. This is 100% compatible. The flash turns its power on and off with the camera. Among other things, it takes 2 nice fat AA batteries to give you lots of shooting life. They don't make these flashes anymore. You can follow my links and get a great one for about $100 used off of eBay. And I find the other flashes today are just dinky pieces of garbage, or they use things like AAA batteries, which gives you a fraction of the flash power and recycling speed. If you're using studio strobes, in other words, if you're shooting in a studio and the exposure is entirely by studio strobes, or if you're shooting by flash, say at night with a high sync speed, so you're getting little to no ambient contribution, you want to change how live view works, because otherwise it's going to look totally dark. Go into your custom shooting options. Go to D for shooting display, and D9, where it gives you the option to apply settings to live view. Now it's set to on. So that means if you're shooting, say, to 250th of a second for flash sync in dim light, and there's no ambient light contribution to the final image, well, that means there's no ambient light contribution to the image in your live view, so you'll see a totally black finder. So if you set that to off, now the finder will always attempt to show you a decent picture. It won't show you the effect of color and saturation and contrast settings and so forth, but it will let you see what you're doing so you can focus on your models and get your shots when you're shooting in a studio with studio strobes. For auto white balance, I have a whole section on this in my formal review. There are now 4 different auto white balance settings, which kind of takes the auto out of auto white balance. It's auto 0, auto 1, auto 2, and auto natural light auto. I usually shoot at auto 1, and if it's too warm or too cool for me, then I just go directly to the Kelvin settings and force it to what I want it to do. For long exposures, the Z7 Mark II now has 2 great ways to do that. There's a time setting in the manual exposure mode. So if you go to manual exposure, go through here, you go through your slower settings. You'll notice once you pass 30 seconds, right between bulb and X-Sync, there's time exposure. What time means is when you press the shutter button once, it's now exposing and taking your picture. And you can get back an hour later, half an hour later, 5 minutes later, 3 hours later, whenever you want. And when you press the button again, there you go. That was your exposure, however long it was set. A better way to do it is I just want to make timed exposures and let the camera worry about it. To do timed manual exposures that are longer than 30 seconds, you have to enable that. You go into D6 under custom setting menus, and under D6, extended shutter speeds in manual mode, set them to on, and now you have beyond 30 seconds. It goes from 30 straight to 60, but I didn't program this camera. But it does go out to 15 minutes, which is 900 seconds. That is a cool feature. For movies, because especially I programmed my red button to be a different feature because I don't use this for movies, what you do is you have to turn this lever to the movies. Now, the controls all do different things depending on how you program it. In fact, now the red button will take movies. U1, U2, and U3 are one of my favorite features. I can program about 2/3 of what the camera is set to into U1, U2, and U3. I program U1 for program auto exposure and very high saturation and sharpness for my landscape shots. I'll program U2 either for people shots or as the same as U1, except it'll be aperture priority mode. Then U3, I'll either program for use on a tripod, which will be fixed ISO at ISO 64 and usually aperture priority set to f8, or maybe I'll set that to people, or maybe I'll set that for how I shoot sports. I wish I had more of these, but that's what I do. And that way, when I'm out shooting, if I'm photographing landscapes, boom, and suddenly I want to make a people shot looking the other way, I'll go back over to U2. Then about 3/4 of the things I would set, things like autofocus modes and contrasts and picture modes will change with that. And again, the user's guide on my website, links to that in my description, will have complete descriptions of how I use these modes, and it even has the file you can download and load into your camera of exactly how I set up my camera. Because last but not least, you can save and load the files that represent how the camera is set. When you go into the wrench or setup menu, save and reset user settings, that's how you program these U1, U2, and U3s. So you can set up the camera however you like it, then save it to U1 or save it to U2 and save it to U3. Then you recall them simply by turning this dial. Now you can do some things here. You never have to clear them out. If you want to change one, well, you call it up, boom. Now I have U3 called up. Change whatever you want in the settings, and then save it back to U3. Hope that makes sense. In other words, recall the setting, change it, save it. That's how you edit it. And if you want to get the camera configured to begin with, well, I set the camera how I want it, and I set that into U1. And then I'll change some settings that might be relevant for a different kind of shooting, and then save that into U2, and so forth and so on. To download my pictures, I prefer to use a card reader. I find that's much handier. Pop this out, stick it in. I do not attempt to plug my camera into my computer because that's usually very slow. However, when the Z7 came out, which was awful because it only took these ridiculous XQD cards, and I was too cheap to buy a proper XQD reader for a few months. Then I attempt to plug my camera in via USB into my Mac, and on my Macintosh, I used Apple's native image capture app, and that even works on my 2007 iMac just fine. It'll recognize this camera and let me download from the card. And that's it. That's just a few little tips and tricks I use with my Nikon Z7 Mark II. If you really want to know how to take great pictures, again, check out the links in my description. Go to kenrockwell.com, click the how-to, and there's tons of articles there about how to see and recognize and take good pictures. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell, kenrockwell.com, and kenrockwell.tv.